Have you ever heard a story so many times that it becomes the truth? Not just a story, but an undeniable fact, a bedrock of your entire world. For the English settlers in 17th century New England, there was such a truth. It was a rule they believed without question, a belief so deeply ingrained it felt as natural as breathing. This rule was simple. The Wampanoag people were their friends. They were loyal allies who, in the English view, owed their very survival and all their prosperity to the protection of the English crown. This wasn't just wishful thinking. It seemed to be built on solid ground. Think back to the very first, starving English colonies. Places like Plymouth. They wouldn't have lasted a single harsh winter without Wampanoag help. It was the Wampanoag who provided food when English supplies ran out. It was they who offered guidance through an unfamiliar and unforgiving landscape. And crucially, it was their political restraint, their decision to help rather than destroy, that allowed these fragile English footholds to take root. This initial dependence created a powerful narrative of Wampanoag goodwill, a story the English were more than happy to tell themselves. But it didn't stop there. Over the decades, this belief seemed to be reinforced at every turn. It was like building a house, with each event adding another brick to the foundation. There were official treaties, signed with solemn ceremony, promising peace and mutual respect. There was bustling trade, a constant flow of goods back and forth that seemed to bind their economies and their futures together. Furs and tools, knowledge and weapons, a complex dance of exchange that suggested partnership. They even had shared enemies. When other native nations posed a threat, Wampanoag and English forces sometimes stood side by side, creating a sense of us against them that further solidified the idea of a special relationship. There were also constant public displays of cooperation. Imagine a colonial governor meeting with a Wampanoag sachem, exchanging gifts and speeches, all for the public to see. These moments were political theatre, designed to project an image of harmony and stability. For the average English settler, these were powerful confirmations of the established order. This idea, this truth about the friendly Wampanoag, wasn't just a grassroots belief. It was broadcast from the very top of colonial society. English governors declared it in their official proclamations. Colonial ministers preached it from their pulpits on Sundays, weaving it into a divine narrative of civilizing the New World. Militia commanders drilled it into their soldiers, assuring them that the real danger lay elsewhere, with other, less civilized tribes. The message was consistent, it was pervasive, and it was repeated relentlessly until it hardened from a simple assumption into an unshakable doctrine. This doctrine became a part of everyday life. Parents taught it to their children as they sat by the fire. The Wampanoag were the good Indians, a simple, comforting label that erased all complexity. They were the ones who had welcomed them, the ones who had helped them, the ones they could trust. Imagine being an English child growing up in a small, isolated farmstead, surrounded by a vast and sometimes intimidating wilderness. The idea that your closest neighbors were steadfast friends would be more than just a political fact. It would be a source of profound psychological comfort. And so, soldiers marched with a false sense of security, their minds focused on potential threats from the north or the west, never suspecting the ground they stood on might be less stable than they thought. The English colonists, from the farmer to the governor, told themselves a story. They told themselves that peace with the Wampanoag was permanent. Why? Because it was convenient. It was much easier to believe that the Wampanoag's gratitude for English protection had replaced their desire for their own sovereignty, their own right to rule their ancestral lands. It was a comforting delusion. They told themselves another story, that submission would naturally follow what they called civilization. In their minds, as the Wampanoag adopted English customs, English religion, and English ways of life, they would naturally accept a subordinate role. They saw conversion and assimilation not as a choice for the Wampanoag, but as an inevitable path toward a peaceful, English-dominated society. This belief was steeped in a sense of cultural and spiritual superiority, They fundamentally misunderstood that adopting new tools or ideas didn't mean surrendering one's identity or one's right to self-determination. And finally, they told themselves the most dangerous story of all. They believed that men who put their mark on a piece of paper, on a treaty written in a language they might not fully understand, would never, ever raise a weapon against the people who wrote that treaty. They placed their faith in the written word, in the legalistic framework they had created, assuming it had the same meaning and the same binding power for everyone involved. They saw the treaties as the final word, the end of the discussion. They failed to see them as documents negotiated under pressure, representing a temporary and fragile balance of power that could shift at any moment. For over 50 years, this entire world of belief, this entire structure of colonial society, rested on these assumptions. The friendly Wampanoag, the permanent peace, the gratitude that replaced sovereignty, the submission that followed civilization, the unbreakable power of a signed treaty. It was a world built on a convenient, self-serving, and ultimately fragile myth. But then came the year 1675, and in 1675, a single, violent moment, a spark in a landscape soaked with resentment and misunderstanding ignited a fire that would burn across all of New England. In that moment, that house of cards, so carefully constructed over decades, came crashing down. The unbreakable belief in the friendly Wampanoag shattered into a million pieces, forever. The story they had told themselves turned out to be just that, a story, and the truth that replaced it was one of fire, war, and a brutal reawakening to the realities they had chosen to ignore for far too long. Step into the deep, dark woods of 17th century New England, a world on the brink of a war that will change America forever. Our story isn't about powdered wigs and grand declarations in stuffy halls. It's about a man named Benjamin Church, a man of the frontier, a man who walked between two worlds, and the brutal conflict that forced him to choose a side. Benjamin Church wasn't your typical colonial officer. He was 40 years old, raised not in Boston or London, but on the raw, untamed edge of the Massachusetts colony. Imagine this. Instead of learning Latin and military drills, young Benjamin learned to speak Algonquian dialects. He didn't just trade with native villages. He formed friendships. He hunted alongside men who saw the forest not as something to be conquered, but as a living, breathing entity. He was a man shaped by the whispering woods, the winding rivers, and the tense, uneasy borders where two vastly different cultures met. He was a carpenter and a farmer, not a professional soldier trained from European warfare manuals. His knowledge came from experience, from the land itself. As the years passed, Church watched the world he knew begin to fracture. He saw the English colonies expand, not with a handshake, but with the steady, relentless pressure of a legal system the native people couldn't comprehend. He was there when land treaties, written in dense English legalese, were signed. These weren't negotiations between equals. They were transactions enforced by the cold, hard reality of English guns. He witnessed Wampanoag leaders, men he respected, being pressured into selling ancestral lands for a pittance, often not fully understanding the permanence of what they were giving away. He saw colonial courts, places of supposed justice, punish native men for simply defending their cornfields from the wandering livestock of English settlers. The scales of justice, it seemed, were permanently tilted. By the 1670s, this constant pressure was reaching a boiling point. The air itself felt thick with unspoken resentments. The Wampanoag leader, a proud and formidable sachem named Metacom, whom the English dismissively called King Philip, inherited a desperate situation. His homeland was shrinking with every new settlement, every signed deed. While the population of armed and land-hungry settlers was exploding, the English leaders in Plymouth and Boston saw Philip, and they saw what they wanted to see. They believed he would eventually submit, that he would bend to their authority. because submission was the natural order of things in their eyes. They completely misread the man. They mistook his patience for weakness. They mistook his restraint, his attempts to find a peaceful path, for loyalty to the English crown. They failed to understand that for Metacom and his people, this wasn't about loyalty, it was about survival. Then came the spark that lit the fuse. In June of 1675, a Christianized native man, an informant for the English, was found dead. The Plymouth colony swiftly arrested 3 of Metacom's most senior advisors for the murder. A trial was held, an English trial with an English jury. And the 3 Wampanoag men were found guilty and executed by hanging. For Metacom. This was the final, unforgivable act. The execution proved that English law was no longer a shield, however flawed, that might protect his people. It had become a weapon, wielded against them at will. The time for talk was over. War erupted with a terrifying suddenness. The English were caught completely off guard. Their neat little villages, scattered across the frontier, were isolated islands in a hostile sea of forest. Their militia units were made up of farmers and tradesmen, not battle-hardened soldiers. They were brave but inexperienced. And their supply lines back to the coastal towns were long and dangerously fragile. This is the moment Benjamin Church enters our story, not as a spectator, but as a key player. As the first reports of raids and burning farmsteads trickled in, Church understood something that the colonial leaders in their safe brick houses did not. This war would not be fought like the wars in Europe. There would be no grand battles with armies marching in neat columns. No trumpets announcing a charge. The enemy was the forest itself. They moved like shadows, struck without warning, and vanished back into the wilderness. They didn't fight by the rules of any European manual, because they were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence. Church knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that survival in this new kind of war depended on one thing: adaptation. The English had to learn to fight like their enemy, to think like them, to use the land as an ally instead of an obstacle. If they couldn't, the war would end not in victory or defeat, but in total annihilation. So, as the summer of 1675 blazed on, and the smoke from burning settlements stained the New England sky, Benjamin Church prepared to take the field. The English frontier was in flames. The odds were impossible. The challenge stood directly in front of him, a challenge that would test his courage, his knowledge of the land, and his understanding of the very people he was now forced to call his enemy. His journey into the heart of America's first great war was just beginning. The war turns brutal, and it turns personal. You're moving with Benjamin Church, and you see the landscape of New England ignite. The Wampanoag and their allies launch coordinated raids, striking more than 50 settlements. They're not just fighting, they're erasing. They burn houses, destroy crops, and kill families before any militia can even think about assembling. By the end of that summer, the summer of 1675, the toll is staggering. Over 600 English settlers are dead. Dozens of towns are nothing more than smouldering ruins. Church watches this unfold, and he sees the fatal flaws in the English approach. He sees commanders marching their men in rigid, predictable formations straight into dense forests where you can't see 20 yards ahead. He witnesses ambushes that are over in seconds, battles that collapse into chaos before a single order can be clearly shouted. The traditional European way of war is failing, and it's getting his people killed. So, Church proposes something radical, something that goes against every convention an English officer is taught. He suggests fighting fire with fire, using native-style tactics against native warriors. He starts recruiting mixed units, bringing together English volunteers and allied native fighters. He teaches his men a new way to fight. He teaches them to move silently through the woods, to shed the heavy, rattling armor that announces their presence from a mile away. He teaches them to abandon the straight lines and fight with fluidity, using the terrain as an ally, not an obstacle. As autumn descends, a different kind of chill sets in. Fear spreads faster than news. The Wampanoag fighters are masters of their environment. They use the darkness, the worsening weather, and the dense terrain as weapons. The fear is palpable. Entire families vanish overnight, leaving behind only the skeletal frames of burned-out homes and frozen wells. The wilderness, once seen as a resource to be tamed, has become a place of terror. Church leads his scouting parties deep into this hostile territory. They march 4 days, sometimes weeks, without making any contact. But in this new kind of war, silence isn't a sign of safety. Silence means danger. It means you're being watched, stalked, and measured. It means the enemy is choosing the time and place for the attack. When contact finally comes, it's sudden and violent. A burst of musket fire erupts from the trees at terrifyingly close range. The air fills with the crack of gunshots, the splintering of wood, and the screams of the wounded. In that moment of pure chaos, the instinct is to retreat, to fall back to a safer position. But Church is different. He orders his men forward, charging directly into the ambush. He understands the critical truth of this war. Hesitation means encirclement. To hesitate is to die. By pushing forward, he breaks the enemy's plan and turns their ambush into a frantic, close-quarters brawl. The war reaches a grim turning point in December of 1675, the Great Swamp Fight. Colonial forces track a large group of Narragansett, who are allied with Philip, to a fortified village hidden deep within a swamp. The temperature plummets below freezing. The soldiers wade through waist-deep, icy marsh water, just to reach the village palisade, their limbs going numb before the first shot is even fired. The battle is a relentless, hours-long firefight. Gunfire echoes endlessly, and thick, acrid smoke hangs low in the frozen trees, choking the air and obscuring everything. It's a scene from hell. By nightfall, the village is destroyed. The human cost is devastating. More than 600 native men, women, and children are dead, caught in the inferno of the assault. The English forces also pay a heavy price. Over 70 soldiers are killed in the fighting, and many more will die in the following days from exposure and their untreated wounds. Church survives, but the memory of it, the burned homes, the frozen bodies, the sheer scale of the slaughter will stay with him forever. As the war drags into 1676, the dynamic shifts again. Philip's large force begins to fragment. They break into smaller, more mobile bands. This makes them harder to track, but also more vulnerable. There is no longer a single army to fight, but dozens of small, desperate groups scattered across the wilderness. Church and his specialized units are perfectly suited for this new phase. They begin a relentless campaign of pursuit, hunting these smaller bands without rest. There is no safe refuge, no place to hide. The pressure is constant. At the same time, food shortages cripple the Wampanoag. Their stored crops were destroyed, and the constant fighting prevents them from planting or hunting. The brutal New England winter arrives, and their mobility is destroyed. Starvation and exposure become enemies, just as deadly as Church's Rangers. The end comes in August of 1676. Philip, the leader who ignited the war, is tracked to a swamp near his ancestral home at Mount Hope. At dawn, Church's men, a mix of English and native soldiers, silently surround the area, closing the net. It's not an Englishman who ends the war, but one of Church's own native allies. He fires the shot that kills Philip instantly. The aftermath is devoid of honor or negotiation. When Philip's body is recovered, the English commanders order it decapitated. His head is mounted on a pike and displayed in Plymouth for decades, a grotesque and constant warning to any who might dare to resist. The war doesn't end with a treaty or a discussion. It ends with exhaustion, starvation, and total annihilation. It's a brutal conclusion to a brutal conflict, one that forever scarred the people and the land of New England. The consequences of this war would reshape New England permanently. For the English, any lingering belief that friendly tribes could be trusted without complete submission was shattered. In its place, a new, harsher reality took hold. Colonial governments, realizing their vulnerability, began to institutionalize standing militias and create a system of constant frontier surveillance. The days of ad hoc defense were over. A state of permanent military readiness became the new norm. For the native populations across the entire region, the war was an unmitigated catastrophe. Their numbers collapsed dramatically through death in battle, widespread disease, and forced displacement from their ancestral lands. The practice of enslavement became a brutal tool of conquest. Many surviving Wampanoag, including the family of Metacom himself, were rounded up and sold into the horrors of bondage in the Caribbean, a fate many considered worse than death. Their communities were fractured, their leadership decimated, and their way of life irrevocably altered. With native resistance so brutally broken, the English frontier began to advance at a pace never seen before. Lands that were once contested or cautiously shared were now seized and settled with impunity. The psychological barrier of a powerful native presence was gone, replaced by an aggressive, expansionist confidence. The war didn't just clear the land, it cleared the way for a new colonial mindset. Militarily, the war was a brutal but effective teacher. Benjamin Church's innovative tactics, born from the unique challenges of the American wilderness, became official doctrine. The traditional, formal European methods of warfare, with their rigid lines and formations, were abandoned as impractical. They were replaced by a new, uniquely American way of fighting: frontier warfare. This meant small, agile units, a deep understanding of the terrain, stealth, and a willingness to adopt and adapt native tactics for their own purposes. This shift would influence American military strategy for centuries to come. Perhaps the most profound change was a philosophical one. The war taught the colonies a dark and enduring lesson: survival, they came to believe, did not depend on coexistence or negotiation, but on total domination. The dream of a shared new world, however fragile it might have been, died in the ashes of burned villages. From this point forward, the relationship between colonist and native would be defined not by a desire for partnership, but by a relentless drive for control. Benjamin Church himself, the reluctant hero of this story, lived long enough to see the world he had helped create. He would go on to write about his experiences in the war, and his accounts are a fascinating mix of emotions. You can feel his pride in his military successes, in his ability to outthink and outfight a formidable enemy. He details his strategies with the satisfaction of a master craftsman. But threaded throughout his narrative, you can also sense a deep and abiding moral unease. He grapples with the sheer brutality of it all, the loss of life on both sides, and the destruction of a people he had once known as neighbors. He was the survivor, the man who walked away when thousands did not, and that burden seems to have weighed on him. He saw firsthand what happened when diplomacy failed and fear took over. Imagine the generation that followed, children growing up in towns that were literally rebuilt over the burned ground of their former homes. The stories they heard were not of peaceful harvests, but of ambushes, massacres, and desperate sieges. The very landscape was scarred with the memory of violence. This trauma became embedded in the cultural DNA of New England, shaping its identity for generations. And what of the Wampanoag? They survived. That is a testament to their incredible resilience. They endured as a people, as a culture, holding on to their traditions, their language, and their identity against overwhelming odds. But they would never again exist as a sovereign power in their own land. Their political and military strength was broken, their ability to determine their own destiny stripped away. Their story became one of survival and resistance in a world that was no longer their own. So why does this story, buried under centuries of history, matter so much today? It matters because it's a stark and powerful example of how fear can poison relationships, turning allies into enemies, and cooperation into a campaign of extermination. It shows us how quickly societies can descend into brutality when they feel their existence is threatened, and how easily the other can be dehumanized to justify horrific acts. It also matters because history has a tendency to remember peace more comfortably than it remembers violence. We prefer the sanitized stories of pilgrims and friendly feasts, but the story of King Philip's war reminds us that the foundation of the nation was also built on conflict, conquest, and immense suffering. To ignore this part of the story is to misunderstand the whole. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please click the like button. It truly helps us keep this history alive and reach more people. We are a team dedicated to rescuing these forgotten but crucial stories from the archives, and we invite you to subscribe and join us on this journey. We love hearing from you, so please tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you have someone in your family who served in any conflict, we would be honored if you shared that with us. Thank you for taking the time to watch and for helping us ensure that Benjamin Church Metacom and the more than 600 settlers and thousands of Native Americans who lost their lives in King Philip's war are remembered, because history only survives when we, together, choose to remember it.